To a system that is to a system that is built on purpose to empower stakeholders. So then I will give a quick motivation for those people who those CEOs and leaders of technology companies who are no nonsense profit maximizers, who care about making a lot of revenue, and why should they care about AI and ethics and empowerment and so on. And that will give a little bit of a motivation for them. And then I will give you a recipe that I have developed from other pieces that logically fit together quite well for pluralistic ethical AI. So an AI system that, in a sense, represents a multi-ethical society or a group of users that may have different ethical models that are relevant, that are deep-rooted in some sense. So here I want to just give a quick definitions. Augmented artificial intelligence, which I call AI, and we'll see why. The theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, and translation between languages. This is from the Oxford Language Dictionary. I don't take any issue with this. But what I'm trying to say is how I'm not defining it is to say, for example, as a simulation of the human mind or something like that. Rather, useful algorithms that do something that we were doing previously. Ethics is a subfield of philosophy that asks what is the good life, and by extension, technology should support this good life in order to be ethical. And then this runs into this field of social choice in a way, and that's why we should know what that is. It's a field that is concerned with combining individual opinions, preferences, interests, or welfare measures to reach some kind of collective decisions. And then human-centered AI is any type of AI that is coupled with human processes. So this is actually relevant not to algorithms that don't have any interaction with humans, but this is really what I'm talking about is relevant to any kind of algorithmic business model, or business model that is supported by algorithms, rather, that involves a lot of humans, that has a lot of regular interactions with humans and is working with humans to achieve something. And then here let's quickly look at what is the good algorithmic system. And on the left are the usual things that you see being sold for artificial intelligence applications on LinkedIn and so on. And for example, you can have a recommendation engine that increases. Amazon built a recommendation engine that increased its revenues by 35%. It's an incredible number, but it also does some other things that we might not think about, which is it makes popular books or popular authors even more popular. It basically pigeonholes us into reading groups, right? So it's like different people prefer different kinds of books, and then they will never be recommended a book from outside of the sort of cluster which they are assigned with, right? So that means that our reading becomes in some sense more narrow through these and this has been shown in some papers. Then there is this claim that we should use AI to better understand our customers. I don't actually, this by itself doesn't mean very much. It's a quite vague claim, I think. But what is very easy to understand is optimizing marketing expense, and a lot of AI systems are doing that, right? And that is maybe in some ways not very ethically stirring, and we shouldn't worry too much about it. But it's also shouldn't be maybe the priority of a technology company that is trying to improve people's lives. Then self-driving cars is actually quite interesting, because if they indeed have fewer accidents than human drivers, which they seem to have per mile that they're driving, then you can reduce accidents with them. And you also won't have something like for example, drunk driving, right? An algorithm will not have an alcohol problem, right? And it will not have some sort of emotional problems or be driven by some kind of things that may not be optimal for driving. And then smart parking is quite a neat application because it allows people to find parking spots quite quickly, and therefore it eliminates a lot of traffic and CO2 and local smog and so on. And it shortens people's time driving around the neighborhood, and therefore it actually helps a lot of people and doesn't really hurt anyone. I don't see how. I'm sorry, do you have a question so far? On the right side, you see the sort of applications that are in a way unambiguously considered good, right, by most people. So eliminate suffering for patients, rewild the wastelands, eliminate pollutants in the water and the air, make society more inclusive, and eliminate fake news. But those are often not the ones that make a lot of money, and therefore they're often not done. So that's so then what I'm arguing is that an algorithm. So it's very clear to see actually that an algorithm can never be its own intelligence, right? So I think there's a misnomer that artificial intelligence, because intelligence is usually assigned to people who have, or to things that have their own opinion, and not only their own opinion, but they have their own goals. Right? They want to do something, they want to achieve something, like raise children that have a good future, for example. Algorithms have no such concerns on their own. They don't actually solve their own problems. They don't have problems. And therefore, they should be seen more augmentative of some humans. And then you get to that point, you can see that an algorithm that just represents the ethical system of some, say, software COO and maybe the C-suite and a few other people, actually is in a way paternalistic. It imposes its ethical system of a few founders, say, on all of the users and stakeholders, right? So instead, what is empowering is if the algorithm represents the ethical ideas, the deep-rooted ethical ideas in the purest form possible, that are elicited from the users and the stakeholders that the algorithm engages with or has some effects on. So then, but that's interesting because then we run into the same problems that crop up in social choice. So here we have a nice little story, and move this over here. So and this story is meant to illustrate that there are deep-rooted and perfectly sensible ethical theories that run into each other. When they run into each other, they can cause problems because they're all valid, but they can't be. There's a conflict, when a decision is to be made. So here's a little story that illustrates this. There are three friends, Anna, Bob, and Clara, and they're walking along the same path until they get to a three-way fork in the road, in which they must separate ways. But before they can say their goodbyes, they have a difficult decision to make. They have a flute, an instrument, a musical instrument, that must be permanently given to one of the three children because they're separating ways permanently. Anna says the flute should be given to her because she's the only one who knows how to play it. Bob says that the flute should be handed to him because he's the poorest among all the children and he has nothing else to play with. Clara says that the flute should be given to her because she is the one who made it. Now, this is adopted from a Amartya Sen's book, the idea of justice. And what it illustrates is that there are these three theories and they correspond with Peter Singer's, for example, is a representative of a school called utilitarianism. And so if Anna gets the flute, it's everyone is better off because she can play it and actually use it and bring something into the world with it. And that's called utilitarianism, where Bob argues that he's the poorest, and therefore he should be given the flute. That corresponds to a school of thought that is egalitarianism. And there are different versions of that. John Rawls is a great representative of this school of thought. And then we have, lastly, we have, libertarianism, which argues that because whoever made it owns it, right, until they sell it, basically. They're also libertarians, often against taxes because of this. But all of these three schools of thought come from prominent ethicists, and they have complete ethical systems that are all in a way defendable. There's nothing you can say against them. They are reasonable in and of themselves. But when you have to give the flute to someone here, and this is what it illustrates, right? You have to choose one of these schools of thought in a way. And that's and that shows that in a way that ethics is different from facts, right? They are in facts, and there's a truth. There's a one thing that either happened or didn't happen. Whereas in ethics, there are reasonable, there are good reasons to do one or the other thing. And there isn't one optimal solution to ethics in that sense. So you have to use some sort of meta-ethics, for example, voting, right? To know who in our society is, we have here 47% of this group of LinkedIn people who answered my poll, who said that Clara should get the flute, right? So because she made it, and 41% people think that Anna should get the flute. That the music is really the ultimate aim of a flute. And then there are only 12% who are egalitarians. So if you were to say, okay, these are the people who are affected by the algorithm, and they're all equally affected, you might want to choose C, based on the fact that the majority thinks that's the right thing to do. But let's say we find out by further investigation that actually everyone who's affected by our algorithm, all the children that are, that actually have an egalitarian view here, then of course we should give it to B, even though in the general population, maybe there are only 12% of them. The people who are affected by the algorithm have a much greater weight, right? So this is ultimately what we aim to get to. And here, AI. So here I want to cover the usual concerns about bias, and where that they arise ultimately from the fact that machines always do what humans ask them, no matter how smart the machine appears to be. So here we have we have some newspaper clippings that that were big headlines about artificial intelligence and the sort of harm that it does. And so there are racial biases found, for example, in a major healthcare risk algorithm. And the reason why that is because the healthcare cost was used as a proxy of risk, right? So if you're using some luxury health products in addition to what you need, for example, you run up the cost, but you will not necessarily, because of that, be also higher risk. Right, so it will be more correlated with wealth than perhaps with anything. Then Amazon built this hiring algorithm that was meant to help them hire people, and they used previous CVs that they actually used to hire people in order to make their hiring decisions. And because in the past people at Amazon were sexist, and there was a bias in the algorithm, because that's it reproduced the biases of the people who in the past made such decisions. And then there is this, the last case I want to talk about is that there was an analysis done on an algorithm that's called Compass, which is an algorithm that feeds in information about prisoners who have served some time in prison, and it is to make a prediction whether this prisoner will commit another crime if we release them today. So, and therefore, the release decision is actually made on this on the back of this algorithm. And so we have to think about this algorithm. And you can see here on the left we have the Black population of prisoners who this algorithm makes decision on. On the right, we have the white population, and these are the risk assessments that they make, right? So this distribution of risk assessments, and you can see that in the white population, they are all bunched up to the left, which means low risk, right? So the algorithm says that they are low risk. On the left side, you can see the distribution for risk assignments for the Black population, and you can see and it's a uniform distribution. So it's quite, any kind of risk level might be assigned to you. Whereas if you're white, most likely you will be assigned a low risk level, right? And we cannot say why this is in this case, because it's a proprietary algorithm, so there's no way to know how it works and what kind of data was fed into it. Here are 3 movies that illustrate the problems, that illustrate what sort of things can go wrong by having algorithms in a human-centric sort of system, human-centered systems, or what I'm talking about, algorithms that interact with human beings. And these movies were quite popular, and they were, and they actually show some really problematic things that can go wrong. And I have them here in order of nefariousness. So we're starting with a movie that is about bias, that has to do with data imbalances, where the AI was basically trained on biased data, and it caused a lot of problems with facial recognition in the African American community. That's called Coded Bias. And then the second movie is actually about a business model, right? It's a disinformation for profit business model, and that's called The Social Dilemma. You can see these movies are quite interesting. The last one is the most nefarious version of this, where PSYOPs military electioneering techniques were used on the American population in the 2016 election. That involved also lots of data from Facebook and so on. There was a big scandal about it. It sort of went and fizzled out and went away, but the movie illustrates quite well what actually happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. So there are 3 main issues with algorithms beyond the social choice problem that I posed before. This problem when there's different ethical beliefs that are well justifiable, that come into conflict with each other. And these are, the business models are often not based on furthering human freedoms, but instead they might be selling our attention, for example, and doing things that actually short sell us, most of us, and they benefit some small number of people. The advertisers, for example. And then algorithms lack transparency. That we saw that in this case of the recidivism algorithm that predicts recidivism. We don't know why it's biased. We just can see the outcomes. And then, lastly, users are not empowered to improve the system. I think this is actually a really important aspect that's often not discussed so much. And then, as I promised, I wanted to give a good motivation for the no-nonsense profit maximizers among you, people who want to build big and important businesses that have a lot of revenue and so on. And what it really is all about is about trust. Because if you get huge lawsuits, you will see that it's not just those lawsuits that you will have to pay money to whoever sued you, perhaps, but also the motivation of your employees, as well as the trust of the customers, right? So you can be actually a hero to your users and to all of the stakeholders by simply representing their ethical views and making algorithms and the business model be in line with their basically with their ethical views. And that is the objective. And then you have sustainable revenue. People will buy your products. You will have a very trusted and empowering brand that people will love. So then the answer for all of this is to have a recipe for ethical pluralism. And this is, there's an opinion piece in Nature that's quite interesting that actually shows this importance of what an AI should be, right? This should be an AI for good, should be, what kind of ethics, what we're talking about, should it be, sort of fair and non-biased and so on. But what really, I think, is overlooked is that what we should pay attention to is how algorithms shift power, and whose ethics we're talking about, and that's so then the answer for that then lies in participatory AI. So we're building things together to benefit to benefit humans and human freedom. So if you have a company where you're trying to enable people to do something that they couldn't do before, that's you have to think about that, and you have to maximize that sort of enabling factor. And for that, you can have this participatory toolkit, And the idea here is to really create vibrant participation with the stakeholders. And you can even gamify it. There's a lot of really great techniques in that. So the system that I propose ultimately is a system that is based on a moral, philosophical framework by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum that is, unlike most ethical frameworks, non-paternalistic. So it takes seriously people's ethical foundations for wanting something and for needing something. And there is this really incredible, system for specific to building technology, which has been developed by people over the years. It's called values-sensitive design. And it is adopted by a few papers recently that I have here on my slides. To go with this, to basically fit with this moral philosophy developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And so that is what I am further developing and that I'm working with in order to help companies to build empowering AI systems. And so all of that starts with a conceptual investigation, which is a workshop where you map out really who your stakeholders, your direct and indirect stakeholders are. But you actually, before that, you map out what are the capabilities and functionings that you want people to have from your technology, right? So what is your technology about? Whom is it meant to empower? And what kind of end, right? What can they do that they couldn't do without it? And then you start looking into the stakeholders, and then you make it very specific. You are trying to look at the distribution of abilities that you are enabling, right? So some people might not be able to use your technology as well as others, and therefore they are able to achieve other different things, perhaps lower things, or not as as much as others. And this conceptual investigation is all about that, really mapping out whom can you enable to do or to be something that they couldn't do or be before. Then that whole discussion, once you have this map, once you have an understanding of what kind of capabilities you want to achieve for what kind of stakeholders, you move into the technical investigation where you're mapping out what sort of algorithms, what sort of technologies, must not always be algorithms, can achieve these capabilities for those kinds of those sorts of stakeholders that you have in your discussion, down to really what services do we use? Do we use AWS or Google Cloud Platform? Do we what sort of maybe we use some TensorFlow and so on. All of these things will then be mapped out into technical investigation, which then leads to an empirical investigation where you sort of complete the cycle. You want to learn whether or not the conceptual investigation that you started with is reasonable, right? Whether these stakeholders that you mapped out are in fact your indirect stakeholders, and whether they achieve the sort of capabilities that you decided they should achieve with your technology. Right? And then once you have a pipeline for empirical investigation that basically keeps track of these things, you can go back to a conceptual investigation and so on. So it's a cyclical system, but this cycle can then, as you go on and you keep building, you actually close this cycle to become a continuous cycle, right? So you continuously improving your technical solution, your empirical understanding, right? So you keep pushing the envelope of what you can measure and how you can measure it, and also on the conceptual side. So you ultimately it becomes a continuous thing. So yeah, again, so here I have the details of it, right? So what are the capabilities and functionings that are relevant to the design context? Then who are the stakeholders, indirect and direct? So this is important. So you can think of it, for example, who could be indirect stakeholders, right? So you might have this question, what do you mean by indirect stakeholders? And that's, you could say that, for example, in the case of someone being sick and you help them in some way that they couldn't work before, or act in the household, for example, you give them some sort of technology that enables them to work better in the household, so for example, do the dishes or something, and of course, the rest of the family will be affected by that, right? So those are the sorts of considerations. And there are some other examples you can think of, so many of the technological systems really have effects on other people, not just the people who are directly interacting with them. And then, yeah, you want what I said before, these conversion factors. So what does that mean? It's like, how do different people with different abilities and different desires and different interests actually achieve different types of capabilities and functions, as I said before. And this distinction between capabilities and functioning isn't something I can talk about now because it's a little bit more involved, and there's a lot of depth to this ethical framework that comes from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. Then we're moving into the technical stage. Again, I already described this quite well, I think, before. We don't have to belabor the point. And then, here, we're really, when we're talking about the empirical investigation, we're talking about the data science side of things, right? So we want to measure, to what these capabilities and functionings that we assume people might, the conceptual stage that people might achieve, and we want to actually measure whether that, to what degree we're successful in this, and then we can improve on it. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very timely as well, like the who is shifting power to who, considering like massive multi-billionaires buying tech companies this week.
Yeah.
It's
True,
definitely a topical issue.
Yeah, because what they're buying also is the computing power, right? So this is something that goes to the beginning of when the internet was invented. You can see Jaron Lanier, I think this is, I'm sorry, I might mispronounce his name terribly. He has talked a great deal about this. He was part of the original conception of the internet, and they thought, oh, if you make all the information free, right, everybody has equal access and so on. It was done in a good spirit. But then the realization later came, well, if you don't also make the computational power free or, available to everyone, then what you will have is this, huge, basically this recreation of the same power structure as before, the corporation to that power.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of someone imposing their ethics on somebody, but also Microsoft and Facebook being the only people able to train enormous neural networks.
Yeah, they have the massive amount of computation, right? And then the thing about power, computational power. The other thing they have is, so they build these. They have the engineers to build the algorithms, right? They build the algorithms, from their perspective. And maybe they have ethical. They have a lot of ethical considerations, perhaps, but they don't have to be necessarily in line with the user's ethical considerations, right? So that's, I think, makes it somewhat paternalistic.
I have loads of questions I could ask. I'll go around the room though before I ask more of mine. Does anyone here have any questions for our speaker?
Yeah, I'm happy to launch into a light question to start with. When you spoke about Amazon, Johannes, there were kind of two things that you mentioned. One was they're both the same thing. It's the sort of narrowness of the algorithm, and I was pleased to see that you used the word algorithm, not AI, there. And one was about reading. That basically what it's doing is it's using a classifier in order to determine what my reading habits are. And it's never going to ask me anything outside, never going to offer me anything outside of that. Whereas a human being is more likely to do that. And then,
well, there are ways to build recommendation engines that are not based on, this is based basically on what is called collaborative filtering, right? So that means they look at people, they look at the books you like or buy, right? Or both, actually. So maybe you give them stars and you buy some and then they compare you to someone else who buys the same books as you.
Yeah.
Do, right. So and then they will find holes of books you haven't bought and liked yet that they have bought and liked. Right. So that's That's ultimately what it's based on. So, but then if you think this through, is you arrive at this cluster of people who are similar to each other, and they'll read all of each other's books, right? So then you have this bubble of people who read each other's books. Basically, it's as if they all recommend each other's books to each other, right? It's kind of a bit like that.
Yeah.
And then you're never going to get anything from another cluster of people, you know.
Yeah.
And so you always, I feel like you always need to disturb your, you know, in terms of reading in particular. I mean,
Yeah.
I like to do that. I always disturb your comfort zone a little bit by bringing in some thinker who's, you know, has rigor in their thinking, but is outside of what you know and what you usually like.
Okay, so my question is, because you shied away from this, do you want to opine on whether you think what Amazon is doing is good, bad, or perhaps you're completely indifferent?
Well, no, I mean, it's bad when we are put into these pigeonholes. So I think that's part of it is bad, right? So if and it's not like I don't know how bad it is. You know, there are some papers on this that talk about the sort of it's contributing to what is that called, polarization, right? So we talk about this in politics, you know, polarization. People go into their communities, the two communities in America, there's two, and many places there's two, but in this case there might be more, right? So there might be people reading in utilitarians, you know, they read all of the different utilitarian ethicists, for example, right? But they'll never see another reason to do something else, right? Maybe, you know, that's kind of. Am I cutting out?
No, I'm hearing you perfectly.
Okay, good. I think my camera. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the worry there, right? So what you could do instead is you could make recommendations based more on content. Right, so that you know, for example, you have this big knowledge graph that relates things to each other, right? It says that, for example, Peter Singer's book is an ethics book, you know, it has something to do with ethics, right? And there are other ethicists and so on, right? And it can explore the space in the sort of way that you would do if you were perusing Wikipedia and you started following links from there, you know, and that way, you know, you will have a recommendation that's much more based on content, on interest, and what interests you, and then it might lead to all the different views about what it is that interests you, right? So, and not just the ones that all of your friends like. In other words.
We have a question in the chat from Mary A that says, how can we get more people to understand the points you brought up during this presentation?
Well, by making this presentation go viral, I suppose, you know, and not just this one, but you know, other ones, and you know, that's what I'm trying to do. Ultimately, that's the path I'm on, right? So I want to practice it. So I seek people who are clients, and I can give more case studies. There are case studies I didn't bring up. I should have. But there can be more, right? So there can be much more experience with this kind of system. So that's what I'm doing. On one hand, I'm selling my experience to help people build such systems. And so by doing, we will also learn more, right? And we can report it back. And I guess that's what the process is. And then, you know, as things become, you know, as you can see the difference in it over time, right? So it might take some time to establish it as something that really truly empowers people. And as this, you know, then it's naturally going to come around, right? And say, okay, that model really does work for us, right? That technology that comes from this process really does empower us. And when we experience that sort of technology, we really like it, right? And so then it will naturally, you know, immerse, you know, there will be businesses, there will be many businesses that will build their technology in that way. There will be trusted brands that people will you know, see as their heroes, as they empower them to do more things and to be more things. And I think that will be naturally, that's what I'm relying on, ultimately spreading the message. You know, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah. Do you feel from your experience that people are getting sort of wiser to these systems that they interact with on the internet?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of buzz about ethical AI. That's a good sample. That's a good sign of that, right? And the European Union is working on legislation with AI and so on. So there is this natural buzz about it. But to see AI, or to see technology explicitly, in this raison d'être, if you will, as empowering of people, that's, I think, not at all. That's not very often. But when I say that, right, sort of like, or when that paper in Nature, right, this opinion piece in Nature came out, where it was made clear that ethical AI should be about empowerment and not about just these sort of marginal things, right? Okay, you can improve the bias issue, you can do that, and you should do that for sure. That should be done, right? But is that really going to lead to the sort of outcomes we really would like to see, which is that technology should be meant to empower us, right? That's the whole point of technology, right? You look to, for example, if you lose a leg, right, you look to technology for a prosthetic that allows you to run around again, right, and so on. You look for technology to enable you in these sorts of things, and that's, I think, the bigger and deeper point of technology.
This might kind of tie in then. This is Marie's follow-up question. Is do you think there's more room here for regulations, laws in government, or do you think change come entirely from companies? Then our second part to this is she mentioned she's got a newsletter from the Center for Data Innovation. And at that point, they were arguing that EU laws were stifling innovation in the space of AI development.
Well, yeah, and it depends on what you mean by innovation, right? So if you mean that, maximum speed at, doing whatever, and we don't know what it's going to do to us, right? Then, then maybe it will slow that down. But that's not, do we want to really rush into a dystopia? I mean, that's the question I would ask in that kind of sense. And I do think that, yes. So I think that definitely regulation will help to curb those who are not on board with, who don't really want to empower people. But for those leaders, for those technology leaders who have as their purpose to empower their stakeholders, the indirect and direct ones, for those, I think the legislation will make no difference. So that's what I hope. They will go onto some bandwagon like what I'm suggesting to them to do, which is capabilities, sensitive design, and then they will run away with that and empower a bunch of users. And no legislation will actually be binding. Right, because they will not run into any of these. They will not design their systems in such a way that you need to, cut into their innovation. They innovate directly for empowerment, right? So if you innovate with that in mind, the innovation is the regulation is not binding for you. But definitely we need regulation because there are companies who just want to maximize their revenues and they don't care if in the long run their brand is completely stained and and eventually they will destroy the company. They don't care about that because maybe in the short run they can make a lot of money. And for them, we need the regulation. And I think that it's very admirable what the European Union is doing with the Turing Institute. They're working with the Turing Institute to come up with ethical AI regulation, and I think that's great. That's really great stuff. But again, it is motivated by, you could say, paternalistic ethical principles, right? So they choose some ethical principles. They have experts, I don't know how many, and they say, okay, this is what is ethical, right? And then it's based on that. So, but that's what I'm saying. You could, but there's no regulation that's going to make people build empowering AI, right? I don't think you can force people to do the right thing in that sense. You hope that they will because of the revenue and the sustained business model and the good brand image and so on, and you just hope that those are enough and also maybe just because that's what their missions. Some people might be actually driven by a mission. So I don't want to just be so cynical as to say that all the technology leaders are people who just want to maximize the revenue, and I'm telling them if they are ethical, they actually can do that in the long run, and that's why they should be. I do think that there are some people who went into technology to enable people to do things.
I guess there's potentially two more questions. I'll start with Murray, and then there's another question in the chat. Murray, would you like to ask your question? You have your hand, if I noticed.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I've noticed. Yeah, it's probably more, maybe more of a comment. But I enjoyed the bit where we were talking about in terms of the perception of ethics, you know, depending on people's socio-political kind of views, if you like. The other factor in there, I think, in terms of perceptions, that really needs to be considered, particularly when you were talking about things like, you know, the use of things like driverless cars in terms of perception of risks, because it's something that I've been quite involved in the past, in terms of how, as you know, as technical people, as professional people, in terms of how we evaluate risk, is quite objective, and is quite calculated. You know, you exampled there in terms of driverless cars. Oh well, if statistically they kill less people per mile, then that's great, isn't it? But from a public risk perception piece, it's actually a far more complex in terms of how they accept risk. You know, it actually turns out people are you know, how they die, for example, is actually, you know, is an important factor, not just in terms of numbers of deaths. Problems like that exist, and I wonder whether that is, you know, something that you've looked at, evaluated,
actually,
as part of that problem space.
Definitely, that is a big part of it, right? You know, who are we to say that the statistical way is an ethical way? What kind of ethic is that, right? You know, this machine kills only 200 people every 10 years, and people kill thousands of people every 10 years. That number, right? So what we're talking about, if we are saying, oh, the one that kills less people is better than the one that kills more people, it's actually utilitarian ethic, right? So it's a very specific one that you may not agree with, right? And I that's exactly the kind of system, the sort of question that you need to tackle, right? And I do agree. People don't like this idea to be completely helpless when for example, when the car crashes and they're in it, and it's this 1 in 1,000 times case, right? Where they're sitting in the you know, in the back of the seat, and the driverless car, the self-driving car, actually crashes. You know, that situation to them seems worse than if they were in a taxi and a taxi driver crashed. And there's no reason to say why that wouldn't be worse. If that's how people feel, that this is, you know, I can't argue with it, right? So then we should actually take that into consideration. We should realize, you know, that, you know, of course, what we can never do is bring down accident rates to zero, you know. So there will be like some level at some point we will have to think, you know, what do we accept from self-driving cars, right? You know, what kind of crash rate do we accept? And we do have to eventually deal with that, but also the way to get to that point is through dialogue with people, right? Through understanding their concerns, assuaging their concerns, and maybe, you know, also giving back to them, you know, what do you know, and in this dialogue there might come, you know, there comes then the solution. That's kind of what I have to take for.
Fantastic.
I may get in touch with you again, Johannes. I'm actually looking at writing a paper probably within the next year, looking at public risk perceptions within the field of AI. So it may be interesting to have a chat at some point.
Yeah, please get in touch. You know, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place.
Maybe we'll end on one final question. This is from Mary A again. So it's kind of 2 parts, so we can. I'll read out the first part, then I'll pause, and there's 2 messages. I'll read out the whole thing, and you could take it from there. So, do you think these organizational oversight consortiums that tech companies are forming may help this issue? And this is sort of biased.
Well, that's a good question. Really good question. So usually those are so this is the problem that I see with these oversight boards and so on. Is they usually adhere to a specific ethic, right? So you often find human rights-based oversight thing or something, right? And what is human rights? Human rights is a list of things that humans have the right to have or be or do. That was decided by some experts, right? And so what if your technology doesn't have anything to do with any of these rights? It may not touch on any of them, right? Then a human rights approach to technological ethics or ethical AI just basically limits you to not infringe on any of those rights, ultimately, right? So it's a bit of a limited approach. I mean, it's, those, I'm not arguing about the human rights list. I think it's probably a very good list. I mean, I've read through it. I think it's reasonable. But it's again, I think, the way Amartya Sen puts it in his book is actually, if you know what is the perfect painting, right? The Mona Lisa is the perfect painting, for example, let's suppose. And then you have a Klimt and a Van Gogh painting, and you have to judge between those two paintings. It will not help you to know that the Mona Lisa is the perfect painting in evaluating those two, right? And so that's something, so you might have this perfect hermetic system of ethics, and often these oversight groups do have that, right? They come into it from a particular perspective, a utilitarian one, for example, and then they will sort of limit the ethical concerns to that set that they know and that they support and present, rather than actually finding out who are the affected people. And I'm not saying that this is always must be the truth. So it could be that this oversight board is established from a capability perspective, and then I would probably agree with it. Then we should have it, right? Because it is meant not to be a paternalistic system, but one that actually asks the users and gets feedback and understands the deeper ethical concerns that they may have. And so there's a very important uncovering process there, because people often think they have an ethical system and they're imperfectly, or they have a degenerate one really in their head. You have to help them to really get to where this ethical system really came from and to the roots of it, and to get actually to the best representation of that ethical system. I think that's really important, so that we don't end up, voting for things just because, someone, this is also, it also helps us to become robust against, say, for example, propaganda.
That makes a lot of sense, starting with the user and what they want from this system and working up.
Yeah,
I think maybe that's all the time we have for today. I'll take time again to thank you for coming to speak with us. That was fantastic, I think. It
was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.